You are all ready to go.
All right, awesome. Give me 1 second here. Let me just share my screen here. Perfect. Let me just know if you can see my presentation. Hang on. I think we're good. Yeah, I think we're good to go. All right, awesome. Well, welcome everyone. And thank you for attending the session. In today's session, we are going to go through everyone's favorite topic, I think, in Microsoft Teams, which is around governance. It's going to be a little bit different. We're going to keep it pretty light, but really the idea with this is around showing you some pragmatic scenarios, explaining to you as well some of the challenges that you might be facing within governance, and because it's fairly late in the day, keeping it pretty light also. So before we start, please donate. I think most people have been to these sessions, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. Please donate to the Chicago Public Schools Fund. Help us improve the content as well. Make sure that you go and at least go and provide some sort of feedback. Big thanks to the sponsors as well. Running a product company, sponsoring some of these events, especially virtually, can be a little bit problematic. You can't speak to people, so please go visit some of the vendors so they do get their dollars worth, I guess, for sponsoring. And also lots of raffles and giveaways. Hey, these are pretty good. Chicago prize pack, that's pretty awesome. Xbox, that's awesome. So yeah, make sure that you go and you register for these pieces as well. So my name is Michal. I'm going to be your host today, and we are going to talk all around governance. A little bit about myself. So I am a Microsoft SharePoint MVP. I have a couple of companies. Previously, I used to be the CEO of a company called Bonsai Intranet. We were quite a large intranet in a box vendor, and we got acquired about 3 years ago. But we used to have an intranet in a box products. We did lots of large intranet implementations for customers, and then we got acquired in 2018. And since the acquisition happened, I had a baby and a dog. You can probably see them behind me virtually. And then back with another product now called Orchestry. Orchestry is our new solution. Really, it's a governance, adoption, and lifecycle management platform for Microsoft 365. It's also one of the reasons that I think I've got a pretty unique insight into some of the challenges that organizations are facing from a governance perspective. At Orchestry, we probably deal with close to maybe 600,000 teams across all of our customers, and seeing that amount of team and that amount of teams and those amount of customers, we're starting to obviously see some patterns and some best practices and things that work and things that don't work, and we're going to share all of that with you today. But if you're interested, feel free to get in contact with me. Go to our website. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. All right. So for a bit of agenda today, first we'll talk about some session goals, just to give you a chance to get out of here. If you think this is an advanced PowerShell session on, configuring the Teams admin center calling, going to be sadly mistaken. It's nothing around that. Then we'll get stuck right in. First thing we're going to talk about is really governance for Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365 from the top level. So really from a strategic level, what are some of the things that you need to think about for outside of the technology to make sure that you have a good governance process or a governance plan in place. Then we'll go down one level and talk a little bit around how governance is actually implemented in Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Teams. Just so you know, there's a ton that you can do out of the box. There's so many options, there's so many controls. A lot of organizations really don't know where to get started because there's just so much there. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a blueprint of the first 5 things that you can actually do to get started around governance in Microsoft Teams. It's not going to be a full end-to-end scenario, but at least it's some way to get you started. And a lot of organizations don't start at all because it's too confusing. We'll really show some pragmatic steps that you can undertake. And then the last part of the presentation, which is going to be most of it, is what we are going to call pragmatic governance examples. So to give you an idea of how you can actually implement some of these policies, some of these rules in the real world, what we're going to do is play the role of 3 different organizations. One organization is going to be called Lockdown Corp, which wants to lock everything down. One organization is going to be called Balanced Industries, and one organization is going to be called Startup Inc. And we'll go through some various governance scenarios and various governance requirements and how we can implement them within an organization. And the reason I find this works is I think a lot of companies, whether they're users or admins or the technology team, they don't really understand just how much flexibility and how many options you have in out-of-the-box Microsoft 365 governance. And of course, every organization is a little bit different. That's why this governance conversation can be really, really challenging. You could be lockdown corp where you need to lock everything down and that could work for you. Or you could be all the way on the other side called Startup Inc. where you're fine having people invite guests and provision things and share things to whoever they need to. Once at least all of these are options, and we'll talk about these governance scenarios in those specific needs. Then we'll talk about some key takeaways and conclusions. If you do have any questions at any time, please feel free to stop me. It's much more interesting answering questions than listening to myself kind of talk all the way through here. So if you have any questions, just feel free, and I'll make sure that I will try to monitor them over here, and we'll get going. All right. So first of all, some session goals. Just so we understand what we've got ourselves into here. Like I said, I think it's 5 p.m., maybe 4 p.m. in Chicago. I'm out of Vancouver, Canada here. Not a traditional Canadian accent, I know, originally Australian, so I'm sure it's pretty late there. So if you have a beer or any type of alcoholic or non-alcoholic beverage, feel free to crack that open. So session goals. First thing we're going to talk about is a little broadly around governance and strategy and how they play together. You need to have outside requirements inform your governance plan and your governance strategy. So we're going to talk about what those are, what types of documents you need, who you should involve, and how you can start on that first step, that first piece to ensuring great governance in Microsoft 365. Next thing we'll talk about is some of the options and really how governance can be implemented in Microsoft 365. Then we'll talk about some scenarios to kind of level set it. And then really the goal of this presentation is to provide you with some really tangible examples that you can take back to your organization and hopefully implement, or at least start implementing there. All right, so let's talk about the first piece here and talk about governance and strategy in Teams and Microsoft 365. Now, one of the reasons that organizations really struggle around governance and try to get started is they don't have, it's not really a technical problem. It's really much more of a problem from a strategic perspective. Now, the whole idea with governance, particularly around self-service software, which Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365 is to make sure that you're providing an experience for your users that's dynamic and frictionless with robust management. There's a balance between what you're going to allow your users to do and also what types of risks you're prepared to take as an organization as they do that. So when we engage with customers and when our partners engage with customers around governance, typically they have to understand what those organization needs are. What are type of the rules? What types of policies do you have? And really try to understand those. Really, when we think about governance, the best way to think about what governance is, it's really that process of defining the people, the processes, the rules and structure within Microsoft 365 and of course within Microsoft Teams also. Now, a typical governance plan, what does that involve? So how do you get started upon creating one of these even before you start going into M365 and Microsoft Teams and tinkering with all of these options? So a typical governance plan firstly involves roles. So understanding the roles that you're going to have within your organization and those responsibilities, right? So what's IT responsible for? What can end users do? What do Azure AD admins do? Team owners, team members, all of those pieces. The next thing is also understanding some of the processes that you're going to have. For Microsoft Teams, from a governance perspective in particular, things like the Teams creation process, the Teams archival or deletion process, and a Teams renewal process are typically those top-level lifecycle components that you want to look at and you want to understand. You also want to make sure that you understand who owns what. Unfortunately, Microsoft Teams is a product that's built on top of Microsoft 365, which has a huge amount of capabilities. And because its tentacles are all throughout the place, you really need to understand, who's going to own some of the systems, who's going to own some of the tools, what's IT going to be responsible for, as well as what maybe end users are going to be responsible for as well. And then finally, you want to have some policies. So those policies could be things like taxonomy, labeling, version control, all of those pieces. So understanding those, like I said, more from a business perspective. Now, what governance can help you achieve is a few things. It's not just around self-service, but it can really help you achieve a number of different things. And the reason that organizations go down this governance route typically is around compliance. So a lot of organizations have legal rules they have to follow, whether they're legal rules, cultural rules, SOC compliance, for instance. You've probably, if you're a law firm, you have to keep every version of every document you work for instance. If you're a public institution, you're required to keep all content for 7 years, but then that content has to be deleted. So understanding those compliance, those rules and regulations that your industry has is really the first step to start defining a governance plan. The other thing governance can also help you is drive adoption, right? You want to give people the ability to self-service and use this content, but you want to make sure you have enough governance in place, not to stop them from doing things, but enough in place that they can do what they want. And also you have that balance between the risk that your organization is prepared to take. And the other big thing, I think, for a lot of organizations is around managing sprawl. And when we talk about governance, this is what a lot of people think. The idea around governance is, how do we control who can create teams? It's a really common question. The reason for that is, out of the box, as an end user, I can go and I can create as many teams as I want. I can create as many teams called the same thing as I want, which is crazy, but it's an out of the box feature. If you don't believe me, go into your team's environment and start creating 10 teams called human resources. You can do that, right? Microsoft's going to let you do that. So for a lot of companies, it's really around looking governance around managing sprawl, this duplication of teams, duplication of content also. And then there's some other things as well. So stopping information leaks. Maybe you don't want to invite guests in your environment. You can also use it to simplify that end user experience. You can use some of these governance policies to maybe control what users can do, and also performance as well. Now, what's interesting around governance in particular is there's no right answer. And we often say this, there's no right answer for every organization, but there probably is a right answer for your organization. And unfortunately, Microsoft kind of provides you with really two options, unless you look at custom code or Power Apps or third-party solutions, at least from a provisioning perspective, but even from a lifecycle perspective. So either you have everything open, so that's very much the out-of-the-box approach, where as a user, I can self-service teams, I can self-service SharePoint sites, groups, and planner plans. Or conversely, a lot of organizations we find are shutting this down. So this is where users can't go and request teams and SharePoint sites and groups and all of those other pieces, but they have to go through some form of approval process. So maybe that goes through IT, maybe they're using a Power App, maybe they're using a third-party system, something like ServiceNow, for instance, for a lot of larger customers. But the idea is they have to go through a process which can be cumbersome, which can be unyieldly also. So once again, there's not going to be an answer for everyone on the call here, but there is going to be somewhere where you fit in between these two lines. Now, if you don't have governance, what do things look like? So luckily, we have some live data. So this is an example of some of the typical clients that we work with. They have teams, they rolled it out, they never really launched it. It just, COVID happened. They put everyone into teams. People used it for chat, people used it for meeting, and then they started creating teams, right? Lots of growth. It was that out-of-the-box Microsoft approach where anyone can create anything. So they had tons of teams, lots of teams with only the general channel and completely uncustomized, lots of teams with the word testing. We see that all the time in our clients. Michael's lunch test, John's test, demo, all of that sort of stuff. Lots of ownerless and memberless teams as well. Ownerless teams are a particular, I guess, scourge for a lot of organizations, because if a team has no owner, the members can't really do what they need to. They have to go back to IT. But the worst point is, because there's no owner of the team, there's no owner of the content either. And that becomes a huge hassle for a lot of companies and a lot of organizations, where they're like, well, we have this team, there's a bunch of documents there. Like, who owns these documents? Because how can we make decisions around them? And lots of other things that we typically see, right? So this is without governance. Hopefully you're not in this state. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations are, and which is fine. We can go back and we can clean some of this stuff. But the big trends that we're seeing from a governance perspective is lots of organizations rolled out teams. They had self-service enabled. They quickly got into a mess like this customer did, where they have tons of teams, tons of content, people not really using teams, to be honest with you. And when I say they're not using teams, you can see that out of the 3,000 teams, 80% of them only had the general channel. So they're not really using teams. They're not adding any additional channels. They're not adding any additional tabs, connectors, none of that stuff. Really, they're using teams as a way to get to their files in a simpler way than going through SharePoint, right? So from an adoption perspective, really your users aren't making use of those tools either. So we're going to talk about all of that, how we can maybe stop that as well. Now, there's lots of good information. One of the best places to start, though, and Microsoft has done a really good job in terms of helping, particularly from an adoption perspective. If you go to the Teams Adoption Hub in step 2, Microsoft has a really good governance quick start feature, and it's got a bunch of documents and a bunch of things. If you haven't started in your governance journey within Microsoft Teams or Microsoft 365, I highly regard that you check that out. Okay, so now that we understand these kind of high-level strategic things, so let's say we've talked to our organizations, we understand the risks, we understand the policies, we understand those things. How is governance actually implemented within Microsoft 365? And it's not an easy answer. If you noticed, there's no governance admin center, right? There's no somewhere where you go. There's lots of pieces and lots of different admin centers. And this is where people really get confused, because you have to go to lots of different places and essentially try to understand what's going on. Now, in terms of Teams in particular, which we'll concentrate on here, there's really 3 areas, if we look at Teams governance, where these settings are going to be configured. Some of them are going to be on the team itself. Some of them are going to be on groups. So if you know, Microsoft Teams are based on Microsoft groups. Think of a group as essentially a container that holds different workloads of Microsoft 365s together. So when I go and I request a team, a group is also created. A group has things like a mailbox and a calendar and an associated SharePoint site, and maybe it has a planner plan associated with that. And then a Microsoft team really provides a window into those areas within that group. So you've got settings at the team level, you've got settings at the group level, and you've got settings a whole bunch of different places. But particularly around the security and compliance side, you can attach things like data loss protection or retention labels or sensitivity labels and all of those other pieces. How these settings are applied are also at 2 different levels. So you can apply some of these settings at the global level, which applies to everyone, but they can also be applied at a user-specific setting also. So what's really nice is you can have, let's say, your default policy for all of your users, but you can also have specific settings overridden for specific users or specific groups of users on an Active Directory group also. So what are some of these governance controls? There's a ton, and we are not going to go through most of them. We're going to go through the ones we feel are important. But just so you know, out of the box, there's an incredible amount of settings, an incredible amount of options that you can tweak and change to make sure that you can actually have and implement governance in a way that makes sense to you. So here are the ones that typically organizations look at. So things like applications, your third-party Teams app, you've got things like app org-wide policies, permission policies, application setup policies. We'll talk about those all around Teams apps, the third-party apps and the internal apps that your organization has access to. At the team level, you've got things like team settings and channel settings also. So once again, these are particular policies and rules you can put in place at both the team, the teams and the channel settings also, but lots of other types of settings as well. So around guest access and around external access, for instance, and then all of those other areas around Teams, things like messaging, live events, meetings, group classifications, all of those pieces. So the question, of course, is where to start with all of these things. this is what I recommend that you should start. Now, these questions are pretty broad, but at least it gives you somewhere to start, because there's literally hundreds, maybe 1,000 different options that you can tweak. But where you want to start from a pragmatic perspective is probably these first 5 or 6 things. So the first question that most organizations want answered is essentially who can create. So who can create teams, who can create SharePoint sites, who can create groups. We're going to talk about that. But that's really the first thing that people want to understand, and they want to make sure that they have in line. Everyone being able to create everything can work well for some organizations. Typically, it doesn't. It falls down really, really quickly. And people are always shocked by that because, of course, we trust our end users to do everything correctly. And my answer to that is, if you want to see how well people structure information when they're left to themselves, go to any organization, go to their central file share, and then try to explain that to anyone apart from the person who is in their particular folder, how that's structured, right? Everyone creates things in different ways. They call things different ways. It can be really confusing. So once again, the first governance thing you want to talk about is who can create teams and SharePoint sites, and we're going to talk about that. The next thing is around naming conventions also. Naming is really important in Microsoft Teams. Naming can help from a findability perspective. It can help people understand the context of the team. It can help them understand the information that's within a team also. There's certain capabilities and there's certain items that you can use, both out of the box and third party, to control namings also. The next thing is around guest access. So if you're going to enable guests in your organization, you need to have some policies around those. The really out of the box options are whether you're going to enable guests or not. You can make this at a little bit of a granular level by enabling guests only for individual teams or individual groups. It's not something really that you can do out of the box. It's something that you have to do on a one-by-one basis. And then also Microsoft 365 has additional capabilities around guest management in things like access reviews and guest reviews also, but they're part of an additional license. Fourth thing is around expiry. So a lot of the governance you'll find really centers upon the creation part of teams, but of course you also need to have the same governance in place for once teams expire. So let's say you're in an organization, you're creating lots of projects, right? Most projects are going to be transient in nature, and most teams are transient in nature when you think about it, right? They don't exist forever. You might have things like projects or committees or certain business processes that have a defined and a start-end date. You have to think about the expiry of these items also. Then you can look at some of the other pieces. So looking at policies in terms of retention, e-discovery, and DOP is something that a lot of organizations look at. And then the last thing I would also say, if you're going to start, is also around templates. Teams templates can be an incredible way to help both drive adoption by giving people a really good starting point, and also the ability to help provide some standardization also. So instead of people getting blank teams and blank SharePoint sites, you can say, hey, here's how we manage projects, let's say within our organization, and here's how you can basically go forward. But if you haven't done anything in governance, what I would say the best bang for your buck is going to be around the creation. So who can create pieces, understanding guest access, whether you're going to enable guest access or disable it, and looking at expiries and naming conventions also, those first 4. Okay, so how's this all going to work together? So now we go to everyone's favorite part of the presentation, which we are going to role play 3 different organizations. So what we're going to do is we are going to pretend we are 3 different types of companies. And we are going to go through those governance scenarios which I've talked about, and we're going to see how 3 different organizations choose to implement the same governance scenario. And the reason that we're doing that is A, to help you understand really just how much flexibility you have, and then hopefully you're going to identify yourselves in one of these organizations. Now, the first organization that we are going to pretend we're at is Lockdown Corp. Lockdown Corp is a very locked down organization. They've been around for years, a little bit stuffy, right? They are now finally allowing their workers to work from home, but Lockdown Corp, they're good people. They just work in a really highly regulated industry. And because of those policies and because of the governance requirements for the industry they work in, Lockdown Corp is really going to lean very, very heavily to locked down controls. And you'll see that as we go through these. So they're really going to lean, like we say, to restrictive settings. Balanced industries is a little bit more balanced. They're a little bit more mature in their IT outlook. And what balanced industries want to do is they want to strike a balance between IT control and also user adoption, right? So what they're going to do, any decision that they make, they're going to consider how can this work for our users as well as work for our organization. Unfortunately, we don't see many balanced industries out there. We see a lot of lockdown corps. We don't see many balanced industries out there because it does require a little bit more understanding in terms of all of these pieces. But try to be like balanced industries if you can, because you're going to really see just how much leeway you have in some of these settings. And then the last one on the right-hand side is called Startup Inc. So Startup Inc., they're growing rapidly. They're probably doing something in, the technologies which are very, very trendy at the moment. So maybe they've got some blockchain, NFT sort of thing. They've probably got, $1 trillion in VC funding. Everyone's got beanbags, right? Everyone's happy. But as far as Startup Inc. is concerned, is they don't want to limit the productivity of their employees in any way. So they're going to lean to the very, very open settings. Now, if you take anything away from this 50 minutes we're going to spend, it would be this. A lot of organizations are lockdown corp, but they function as Startup Inc. in their Microsoft 365 environment. And the reason for that is if you do not go and change anything in the out-of-the-box configuration options in Microsoft 365, the way that it's configured is as Startup Inc., where everything is very, very open. Now, this can be really shocking to a lot of people, but by default, users can create teams and SharePoint sites whenever they like. Typically, guest access, especially now, is going to be enabled also, and users can basically go and share links and do a whole bunch of other things. So just think about this. If maybe your organization is lockdown corp, but you've deployed Microsoft 365, if you haven't changed any of these settings, you are functioning as Startup Inc. Now, I don't want to scare you or horrify you, but it's something to consider. Okay, so we have our 3 different orgs: Lockdown Corp, Balanced Industries, Startup Inc. Let's talk about our first thing. So let's talk about teams creation, because that's really the obvious place to start for a lot of organizations. How can we implement teams creation in our environment? So the first thing around teams creation, really the decision point around this is seeing who's going to be able to create groups and teams within your organization. Now, this is a question that a lot of organizations really start off with. Like I said, the idea with limiting who can create teams and groups and SharePoint sites, it can be great because it can aid in controlling sprawl and enforcing structure, but unfortunately, it also has the byproduct of additional load. And then that additional load is typically going to be on the IT team. So instead of a user being able to go and just request a team and have it available for them, right? They have to go through some sort of process. Typically, it's an approval process that goes to IT. Maybe IT have to ask people, and then once IT does all of that, they're going to give you a team or a SharePoint site. Now, this is once again very easy to control in out-of-the-box Microsoft 365. So you have the ability once again to lock down the creation of Microsoft Teams and Microsoft Groups. A common question is, can I stop people from creating teams but allow them to create, let's say, team sites? The answer to that is no, because really where this setting is, remember I said some of these settings are a little bit tricky. Where this setting is, you're actually controlling the creation of groups. And because both Teams and Microsoft Teams and SharePoint team sites are both groups, if you disable one of these, you're going to disable the other. It's the same thing with Planner. If you disable group creation to disable teams, users aren't going to be able to create Planner plans either, because when you go in and you create a Planner plan, that actually creates a group behind the scenes. So there's a little bit to kind of think about that also. So from our 3 scenarios, how would this work? So let's go to our next slide here, and let's have a bit of a gander. So of course, Lockdown Corp, right? Pretty typically, they want to lock all of this stuff down. So Lockdown Corp, they're going to disable the creation of teams through the native UI. And what they're going to do is they're going to use a tool to request to control the approval of teams. Now, that tool could be a Power App. That tool could be a completely external tool, like something like ServiceNow, for instance. That tool could be something like Orchestrate. Whatever that is, the way that users get a team within Lockdown Corp is they have to go through a third-party tool, right? That makes sense for Lockdown Corp because they're essentially making that process locked down. Users would have to go through a little bit of a different scenario. Balanced Industries has got a really interesting approach, and I really like this approach, and I recommend it for a lot of customers. So what Balanced Industries is saying is, by default, we're not going to allow anyone to create teams because we know the issues that can arise from doing that. But what they're going to say is, if you go through, let's say, a 10 or a 15-minute training, what we're going to do is we're going to move you into an Active Directory group where you can go and request and create teams, right? This is a really nice approach, I find, because instead of just letting anyone create teams, at least you're saying to your end users, go through a little bit of training. Maybe you help them understand what a team is and naming conventions. It's just some really simple things. And then you've got a nice balance of people that can create teams and people that cannot. So you can set this up really easily also with a little bit of PowerShell. Essentially what you're doing, you're going to have a group where people could go and request an Active Directory group, where people can go and request teams and groups, and you're going to block everyone else through here. And of course, Startup Inc., they're fine. They're fine having anyone can create anything. So once again, they're just going to leave the out-of-the-box options, right? And the out-of-the-box options really are anyone can create anything. So you can see that even for the simple scenario around teams creation, there's a lot of nuance here, right? So Lockdown Corp's locking everything down. Startup Inc. has everything open, and then Balanced Industries is right in the middle there. So like I said, lots of options. All of this is available with a little bit of PowerShell, but it's super simple to do, and just some configuration. And the nice thing is, if you don't like it, or you've done something wrong, or you want to change it, you can do that at any time as well. So we can make that happen. So let's talk about the next thing. So the next thing from a governance perspective is around default and available apps, in particular Teams apps. The questions that we want to ask here, or the question that you should be asking from your governance plan or your organization, is what apps do we want to give our users access to? And is there any applications that maybe we want to default for our users? And you can do both of these things using a couple of different types of policies within Microsoft Teams. Now, as you know, by default, there is a Microsoft Teams App Store, and there is a lot of third-party apps there. I think this morning I had a look, it's over 1,000. So there's a lot of apps here. Now, by default, as a user, once again, if I haven't changed any of these policies, remember I'm functioning like Startup Inc. As a user, I can literally go and add any app to any team that I want. Now, that might be a good thing. That might not be a good thing for a lot of organizations. So you can control that as well, and I'm going to show you how. The other thing as well is there any Teams app in particular that we want to default for people? So particularly from an adoption perspective, maybe there's a particular Teams app that we want to make sure that when someone logs into Microsoft 365, that they have that team app ready to go for them. Now, a really good example of that is your intranet or your Viva connections, for instance. If you've got your intranet through Viva connections, of course, you can make people go through the process of adding it, but you can also use one of these policies to make sure that it's available for them as soon as they log in. So there's lots of flexibility here. Now, the way that we implement this is really through 3 different types of policies. So we're going to go to the Teams Admin Center, and there's 3 things we have to set up. What's called an application setup policy, an application permission policy, and org-wide settings as well. So default and available apps. Let's look at it from the lens of Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp is really going to lock everything down, right? They don't want people to upload third-party apps. They don't want to allow people to upload personal apps. And they don't want to allow people to basically pin apps also, right? So basically Lockdown Corp is like, we're not going to literally let you do anything from an app perspective. So strangely enough, they're locking everything down, right? Hence the name. So how do we do this? So the first thing is on the org-wide settings, we're going to disable third-party apps. We're going to disable third-party apps published to the App Store, and we're not going to allow people to upload custom apps. Then they're going to have an application permission policy where they're going to block the Microsoft apps. Now, this is a little bit misleading, this kind of Microsoft apps. It doesn't mean that the apps like Planner and OneNote and SharePoint and Word aren't going to be available. They're still going to be available. It's some of those other Microsoft apps which are less used. So things like Poly and some other things. But they're not going to allow the Microsoft apps. They're not going to allow any third-party apps. They're also not going to allow any custom apps. Now, the custom apps one is also tricky because your Viva Connections app is actually a custom app. And if you go down this route and you put this permission policy in where you disable or you block all custom apps, users aren't going to be able to have their Viva Connections app. Now, we can get around that and I'll show you, but just something to talk about. And then from the app setup policy, they're not going to allow users to upload custom apps. They're not going to allow any user pinning, and the pin apps that users have basically is going to be. So essentially what it means, if I work in Lockdown Corp, I go into Teams, I can't add any apps from the App Store, right? I can't change the order of my apps on the left-hand side, and I certainly can't pin any new apps because there's no new apps for me to pin because all of them are basically disabled. So Lockdown Corp is locking things down considerably. Now, balanced industries, going to be a little bit more balanced. So balanced industries, they want to allow users to add some third-party apps, but not all of them, right? Because they don't want people to go in and choose from 1,000. Maybe there's a list of 10 to 15 apps. They also have a cool third-party solution. Let's say it's their Viva Connections intranet, and they want to essentially make that available as default. So the way that Lockdown Corp would do this, they're going to allow third-party apps. They're going to allow some custom apps. But where it gets interesting is in this second part here. So what they've actually done, and let me get the old laser pointer here. Tremendous. So you can see here that what they've done for the third-party apps, they've got an option of allowing specific apps and blocking all others. So what they're essentially saying is we're going to allow people to add the Adobe Creative Cloud, Jira Cloud, and Stack Overflow, but they can't then go to the App Store and add anyone else. This is a really good approach. I really like this. It gives you the ability to control that third-party App Store for your users. And to be honest with you, there's 1,000 apps there. Most of them are pretty crap, right? And last thing you want is your users adding these random apps and then calling IT and saying, why does this app not work? This is a really nice way that you can control this. And with the custom app, they're going to allow a specific app and block all others. In this case, it's this very cool tool called Orchestrate, but it can also be your Viva Connections intranet. And what Balanced Industries is also going to do is pin that app automatically for people. So what's going to happen is when someone logs in, they're going to have that app ready to go for them, right? So a little bit more of a balanced approach to here. Startup Inc. is just going to make everything available, right? So they're happy. People can go, they can add things, whatever they essentially want. So I can add any third-party apps. I can add any custom apps. I can pin things. I can change things. I can do whatever I want. Remember what I said from the beginning, people. This is the default option. By default, any user can go in and start adding whatever crazy apps are in the Teams App Store, right? Some of those things are really good. Some of them are bananas. So by default, they can go and do that. So once again, that's something that's important to note. Now, I'm being a little bit facetious. None of these apps are going to be, particularly kind of deadly or whatever. But once again, just so you know, this is going to be that kind of default option. All right, moving right along here. Let's talk about Teams naming policies. What's our decision point here? So our decision point is really we want to enforce conventions on how teams and groups are named because people are really bad at naming things, right? They're bad at naming things normally. People are really bad when they have to name something correctly in the heat of the moment of, oh dear, I need a team. Let me quickly go create one. You can train them in how the team should be named. That all goes out the window as soon as they start typing in the team name, right? It just happens. I mean, it is what it is. Luckily, there are some tools and capabilities in Microsoft 365 that can help you do that around teams or what are called grouped naming. So there's two things that you can use. You can use something called a group naming policy. You can add prefixes, you can add suffixes. There's also things called blocked words. So there might be particular words you don't want people to use, things like acronyms, putting on privacy. Maybe you don't want people to create 50 teams called HR or human resources. You can have them as blocked words. You can stop people from doing that also. But just so you know, this is an Azure AD P1 thing. So unless you have the Azure AD P1 license, you're not going to have this capability out of the box. To be honest with you, though, most organizations do have this. It typically comes now as part of the standard E3 license you have. Now, what are examples of some good namings? Because a lot of people don't actually know how should we name teams. Now, there's a bit of a kind of, I guess, a religious or a philosophical debate in terms of teams naming, particularly in terms of using emojis, right? If you've noticed, a lot of people like putting in emojis within their teams' names. I don't mind that unless people go crazy and they're putting in like rocket ships and stars and, you know, beach balls and a whole bunch of other stuff which doesn't make any sense. But there's also some really good and simple things you can do from a naming kind of policy example. So some typical examples that we have seen. For project teams and sites, having the ability to prepend that with something like PRJ, so people know that it's a project, then maybe a project ID and then the descriptive name can be really, really beneficial. For departments, having like DEPT in front of that, then a classification and then a department name can be really, really useful. Also, that 3-letter prefix right at the beginning of the team can really help users understand really quickly and really easily what that team is for. Is it a department? Is it a project? Is it a business process site? Whatever that is. We're seeing a lot of organizations also, if you have guest or external access, you might have EXT or guest through there. If you're a multinational company, having things like the geography, the business unit, and the descriptive name there. And there's also some really good examples, particularly around education. Seems like the universities do this really good. So one from Harvard is they have the organization or the school name, the department, and the descriptive name also. And it might seem subtle, but it can be really powerful. And once again, you can use some of the capabilities in M365, those group naming. It's also a reason a lot of organizations have an approval process or they use a third-party tool. But it's kind of neat. Like, you know, if I look at this, these names are pretty good, to be honest with you, from teams. But just adding a prefix there, right, or making sure that we have a project or understanding, you know, that this is cross-functional and who it actually belongs to. Just really, really simple things around teams naming. If you want to know more about this, I actually am doing a webinar in a couple of weeks, which is all around teams naming and channel naming and so forth, which I'll get into excruciating detail around this. So if you're interested, just feel free to register for that. I'll give you the details at the end here. All right. Next thing, rocking right along. So team owner and member settings. Now, this is a really interesting one. Your decision point is less around what team owners are allowed to do because there's not much leeway there, right? As an owner, you've pretty much got full-fledged, I guess, teams capabilities. But a lot of decisions are around what team members are allowed to do in particular. The question that you're really trying to answer is what are you going to enable or what are you going to allow your team members to be able to do? Now, like I said, by default, team members can do a lot. If you're a member of a team, you can add things like private channels. You can create and update channels. You can delete a channel if you're a member also. You can remove tabs. You can upload custom apps. You have a lot of power out of the box as a team member. And in some organizations, that's maybe some you don't want members to have. In other organizations, you don't. But typically what we find is for companies that are new to teams, having team members with a little bit less of what they can do can be beneficial because people are very exploratory in nature. And in a lot of times we hear the stories of, you know, a team member goes in, they're new to teams, they see a channel, they're like, I don't want to see this channel. They go in and they delete the channel thinking they're just deleting it for themselves, but they've actually deleted the entire channel for everyone else, right? So once again, there's some things that you might want to consider. The implementation of these settings are at the individual teams themselves. So this is not a setting you apply broadly. These settings can be different across different teams, which can be really useful. All right, so how is this going to be implemented? So let's go back to Lockdown Corp. So as far as Lockdown Corp is concerned, if you're a team member, you ain't doing much, right? What you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to go. You're going to have access to the team. You can have conversations through the channel posts. You can upload documents, for instance. But they're really going to lock down what things can do. So they're stripping off all of the permissions. So members can't create channels, they can't delete channels, they can't add apps. Members can't even go and delete or edit the messages they make in a channel post, right? A little bit extreme, but it is lockdown co-op after all. But once again, you can see just how much control you have over here. So if you're a member of a team in lockdown co-op, essentially you can have conversations. You just can't edit them or delete them, so you better be careful. You can upload things like SharePoint, files, but you can't really change this underlying structure of that team, if that makes sense, right? You can't go in and essentially change it. Balanced industries, a little bit more balanced. So what they want to do, and I really like this approach, is they essentially want the team owners to control the structure of the team, right, in terms of the channels, but they're going to allow their team members a little bit of flexibility to be able to do things like add tabs for their channels or add connectors, and they're going to allow them also to add or remove their messages as well. So this is an interesting approach. Essentially, it's almost like a two-step approach here. So you've got your team owners, which if a member wants to have an additional channel, they have to go to the owner and ask them. But you've given your members a little bit of flexibility here also. I really like this approach. What we see a lot with our customers, with teams in particular, people tend to get a little bit channel happy or channel crazy, as I like to call it, where they just start creating channels, right? And it's like, oh my God, we have all of these channels. What do we do here? Once again, with this approach, you're giving your members some flexibility. But if an underlying change to the structure of the team in terms of the channels has to be done, they have to go to the owner for that. So I think this is a pretty nifty approach. And the last thing is Startup Inc., right? So Startup Inc., what they're going to do is they're going to keep everything open. And once again, remember, I have said this before. So once again, what's going to happen is in Startup Inc., you're going to go, you can do whatever you essentially want to do. And by default, members have got a lot of power within teams also. So you really have some kind of things to basically do there. All right, one more thing we're going to go through pretty quickly, and then we'll wrap this up. Hopefully this was useful. I know there's a lot of information I'm kind of blasting through here, but okay, we're going to talk about something else apart from kind of the collaborative team side. We're going to talk about Teams meeting settings, because not only can you control governance around Teams and creation, all of that, you can also control around Teams meeting settings. Now, there's a ton of governance and rules that you can apply around Teams meeting settings. We're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about content sharing and what guests can do within Teams, because these seem to be the things that can really trip people up, particularly content sharing. Now, I know, because I've seen this and I've done this before, content sharing is where someone like me is sharing their screen within a meeting of lots of people, but underneath my presentation here, I'm working on something that people couldn't see. For instance, the salaries of all of the employees. And you notice when people kind of maybe change or they share the wrong thing, and all of a sudden people are like, oh my God, I can see this information. And of course, the team meeting's recorded, so people, maybe they go in and kind of record that. Well, you can actually block what and how people can share as well through here. So Lockdown Co-op has got this locked down very, very tightly. From a guest perspective, they're not allowing guests in, they're not allowing anonymous people basically to do that. And the only way that people can share anything in their screen in Lockdown Co-op is just by having a PowerPoint presentation. They're not allowing the whiteboard, they're not allowing screen sharing, they're not going to allow participants to get control, all of that sort of stuff, right? So it's really, really locked down there. Balanced industry is going to be a little bit balanced. So what they're going to do is they're going to allow screen sharing, but you can only share an individual application. You can't go in and share your whole screen, for instance. They're also not going to allow external participants to be able to take control over your screen. And from a guest perspective as well, they're going to make sure that people are essentially authenticated through. And the last one is going to be Startup Inc., right? Startup Inc., like I said, they're going to allow people to share anything, pretty open in terms of guests and people joining those meetings as well. Once again, like I said, if you haven't changed any of these settings, you might think that you're lockdown industries, but you're actually Startup Inc. as well. All right, that's a lot of stuff. I know there's a lot to this, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of a flavor to try to understand kind of where you can start with governance. So a few things just before we jump off here and enjoy our weekend. Really think about governance from the perspective of the balance of how do we empower our users while imposing the least amount of controls that we can. And once again, you can use governance from an adoption perspective, you can use it from a risk management perspective also, but think about your users, right? If you're going to err on the caution of letting people do stuff rather than locking everything down. The next thing is, like I said, all of the options that I've shown you here, these are all available point and click in various teams or various admin centers within Microsoft 365. You don't have to be a programmer. You can go and basically do these. And probably the last thing, like I've kept talking about, don't roll out teams without changing anything, right? Remember that you can go and you can change these pieces. And like I said, if you haven't changed any of these, you're going to be very, very open, exactly like Balanced Industries is. So with that, thank you, good people, for joining me today on this 50 minutes. I think we are right on time. I'm going to grab a sip of water, but I will turn it over to see if anyone has any questions. But if they don't, like I said, super appreciate the time. Thank you for also attending these conferences. It's a real thrill for speakers like us and also the organizing team as well. So I'll hand it over to see if we have any questions from anyone in the room here. And Heather, I don't know how you're doing questions. So we just people just typing them, or they shouting them.
The microphone, so if people have questions, they can unmute themselves and ask away. Or if they have the guest tenant, they can chat away in the chat area.
Were you going to share where you said that you're going to do a webinar soon? How do we get a hold of that?
Oh, yeah, good question, Nancy. I don't have the chat thing on here. If you go to orchestry.com, you'll see a thing saying join the next webinar there, Nancy. Just click on that and that'll take you to, that'll take you there. Hang on, let me move this thing here.
I'll say I'm on the site, but I don't see anything that says join.
Just scroll down a little bit and you'll see a pop-up and it says register for the upcoming webinar there. One second. I will show you here. Let's go 1 second here. We'll do this live here. Nancy, you still with me?
Yep, I'm still with you. I'm scrolling.
There we go. Hang on. So see this? You look something that says here. Just scroll down a little bit and you'll see this thing come up.
Oh, that's why I'm on Intelology.
Oh yeah, no, you don't want to go there. You don't want to go there. Yeah, so just scroll down here and you'll see this and you just click on register here and then we'll take you through this registration process. Also.
Wrong website.
That's all right. It's the accent. Listen, it's not your fault. It's the crazy Australian Canadian accent I got going on here. So I totally understand.
And is it
I put the direct link in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Awesome. Thanks, Heather.
And what time zone do you think it'll be in?
Pacific, I think it's at like 10, but you get the recording, so don't worry. If you're not there in person, we'll
awesome.
Yeah. We'll send it over to you. Don't worry, we'll send it over.
Yeah, 10 a.m. Pacific.
10 a.m. Pacific. Yep. All right. If we don't have any questions, Heather, are you from Chicago?
I am from Chicago.
Okay, before we go, as someone who doesn't know much about Chicago pizza, maybe before we go, tell these good people what the best Chicago style pizza in Chicago is.
That would be Pequod's.
Pequod's. I've never heard that. I've heard of some of the other ones which are pretty well known, but okay, there we go.
Yeah, it's quite the battle around here. What the best one is, and everyone who organizes this will emphatically disagree with me. So
okay, got it. Mm-hmm. No, I definitely want to go and check it out. But,
there's even a battle about which Pequod's is the true Pequod's.
Right. Okay. Got it. Okay.
So yeah,
awesome.
There's the original Pequod's and then the Lincoln Park one, but the Lincoln Park one is close to where I went to school. So, you know.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much for putting this on. Super appreciated. I'm sure everyone else probably shares the same sentiments on the call as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too.